The Pixies, written by Dawn Marks. So grab your coffee, sit back, and enjoy the show. Chapter 1. What I'm about to tell you will seem unbelievable, inconceivable, and I'm sure downright made up. I can't help the way that it sounds. I can only tell you what happened, what I remember, and hope that someone finds it within their compassionate soul to believe me. I know that I have to tell someone now because my time is short. I am no longer a spring chicken or a middle-aged woman, let alone the innocent child I once was. I am now what people call over the hill, elderly, kaput. At 87 years old, I am not in denial about my worsening health, loss of memory, or lack of ability to care for myself. I also am no longer in denial about what happened to me when I was just a small girl living in the beautiful forest of upstate New York. If you care to hear the story, please pull up a chair and put on your listening ears. Bring an open mind and an interest in the unexplainable, and I will spin you a tale of small children and pixies. Ah, I see you doubting already. No matter. You're already here, so you might as well hear my tale before calling me crazy. However, you should be forewarned that this is not a cute little tale of children making friends with cute little winged people. This is a dark and frightening tale of abduction and terror, the likes of which most people will never experience. I hope none of you do. It's why I tell my tale. If I can prevent one person, one child from going through what I went through, then I have lived and died for a purpose. So let's see here. Where should I begin? It was the end of summer when I was just a small girl of the age of 4. I lived in the woods on a long winding road without a neighbor for miles and miles. It was just my mother and myself. She was a single mother, which in those days was unheard of. The townspeople always gossiped and stared when we came into town, but she was lucky enough to gain employment from a kindly older lady named Mrs. Willow, who, widowed by her husband, had taken over the small motel they had run together. Mrs. Willow, in her elder years, had hired my mother to do the room cleanings she had done herself for nearly 45 years. She paid her a meager wage of just $1.50 an hour, and of course didn't need her for many hours per week, as it was rare to have more than just 1 or 2 guests in a week. Anyways, as for my father, I never got to ask her about him. Someone once told me when I was about 13 or so that he had been a drifter whom my mother had loved deeply but who had left before knowing of her pregnancy and was never seen again. At the age of 4, though, my mother was my whole world and I was hers, and we had what I would call a wonderful life. That was until that day. A chill runs down my spine just thinking about that day again. It was the day that I went from being an innocent, carefree girl to an adult in a small child's body. On that day, it was a Saturday evening. My mother and I were playing outside the small little shack we called a home. We were having a tea party on the small stump of an old tree that had fallen in a storm years before we moved in. My mother put a small tablecloth over it, and we got out my little tea set that I had gotten for Christmas the year before, and we sat on the warm, soft grass and toasted to another beautiful day together. We smiled and giggled, and even though I can't remember the exact words either of us said, I can remember the feeling of being happy. Just purely joyful in the evening sun. I can remember the sun shining through the leaves of the trees and glittering all around. I can remember the smell of my mother's hair like the lavender perfume she wore. How I miss that smell. How I miss her. Even now, all these years later, I miss my mother more than anyone else I've met in all my years. I suppose I shall be seeing her again soon enough, though. I digress. That day, as we sat giggling and having tea time, we suddenly heard the ringing of our phone through the back door we had left open. Mother loved to air the house out daily as often as she could, and today, being warm and lovely, she had it swung wide open with a concrete cinder block holding it in place. My mother told me to stay put and she'd be right back. I watched her walk away, up the 3 crooked wood steps and disappear into the house, her long lavender-scented hair glistening in the sun as she went. It was then that I heard it. It was the faint sound of, how do I explain this? Maybe like a wind chime or a small flute, a soft trickle of music emanating from the woods at the edge of our quaint backyard. It was beautiful, soothing. It drew me in, and without even knowing what I was doing, I was getting to my feet and headed towards the woods. the soft music growing slightly louder as I neared the edge, but still faint and so hypnotic. I wanted to see what was making that wonderful sound. As I neared the woods, there was something else too. Something sparkling here and there when the light from the sun caught it just right. Curiosity drew me closer and closer. I squinted my eyes to try and bring whatever it was into focus, but it was small. And even though at 4 years old my eyes were a far cry better than what they are now, I still didn't see what that glittering thing was until I was just about on top it. Even when I did see it, my brain didn't register what it was right away. This is where my story may make you question my memory or my sanity, perhaps both. Please bear with me, though, and allow an old dying woman the peace of knowing she told someone, warned someone. Whether you choose to heed those warnings is entirely up to you. Anyways, I leaned down close to the ground, and there on the soft bed of fallen leaves was a very small unicorn with a jewel-encrusted horn. I know that's hard to believe. At first I thought it was a toy, but then it moved. To be honest, it scared the crap out of me and I jumped back in shock. However, then 4 years old me was reaching out to touch it before I even knew I was doing it. I felt like I was in a dream. The world around me hazy and fading into the background. It was like the only thing I could see was this unicorn with its amazing horn, and all I wanted to do was touch that horn. Just once, if it would let me. But I knew it would. A little voice in my head said, "Go ahead and touch it. It wants you to." So I did. As soon as my soft skin touched that horn, I felt it stab into my flesh. It was the tiniest thing, no bigger than the end of a sewing needle, but it was sharp and it hurt like someone had sliced my finger with a kitchen knife. I started to scream, but my voice caught in my throat and I hit the ground, twitching and struggling to breathe. I remember laying there on the ground with the world shaking around me, the sun glaring down on me, blinding me, and thinking I was dying. Even at 4, the logical outcome was undeniable. Even then, I knew that no air meant no life. I scratched at my throat, and slowly, it seemed an eternity, the world around me went black. I thought I was dead. Later on, I wished I was. Chapter 2. When my eyes opened again, everything around me was still dark. I automatically began to scream for my mother. Surely she would hear me and come running. She would turn on the light and brush my tangled hair from my tiny face and rub my cheek. She would tell me to breathe, baby, and follow it up with shh as she hugged me to her, and that wonderful lavender hair would brush against my cheek and I would be safe. That's not what happened, though. Someone did talk, but it wasn't her. I wasn't even sure it was a someone. It sounded more like a something, and the very sound of its voice nearly drove me to the brink of insanity. Something in the dark let out a stern-sounding, "Shut up, you whining little crybaby." The voice didn't sound human, though. It sounded moist, bubbly, as if there were liquid in the throat of the creature who'd said it. It was a, for lack of a better word, evil-sounding voice. I was silent, but tears rolled down my little round cheeks and I struggled to see into the darkness. I reached out with tiny hands into the dark. I reached out cautiously, but I reached out. I seemed to be on a bed of leaves and twigs. The leaves were wet and the twigs were hard. Some of them were poking into my little bare legs that stuck out from underneath my pretty yellow sundress Mother had made me. It hurt, but I was too scared to think about it or even notice. Even as I felt blood trickle down my right leg from where one of them had punctured the skin, I didn't notice. As I leaned a little further into the darkness, I touched something. It was all around me, but my hand could slip past it in parts. Suddenly I knew what it was. It was a cage. I was in a cage. Why was I in a cage? I didn't understand. Cages were for birds or other animals, not little girls. I crawled to the edge and stuck my face up to the bars and realized there was light coming from below me. I struggled to see what it was, and then fear swept over me. Not only was I in a cage, I was in a cage about 15 feet from the ground, just dangling up there in the dark. I peered down into the faint light below me, and that's when I saw it. My fear turned into pure terror, and I was sure something snapped in my brain. I once again began to scream. This time its return screams of "shut up" didn't silence me. My screams were not a choice. They weren't an option or voluntary in any way. It was like something was pulling them out of my stomach by way of my mouth. That thing. Oh my God, that thing that was down there. It still rocks me to my core to even think about it, and I'd rather not. I can't tell you my story without you understanding, though. Fully understanding what I saw, what had me in that cage precariously perched high above the ground. What I saw below me can best be described as petrified wood that has started to rot and grow moss and mold. Rotted, mossy, moldy, wood that had come to life in a vague shape of something that resembled human form. The dimensions were all wrong, though. The arms and legs too long, too thin. The back curved much like my own back does now. Even in the darkness, I could see things slithering around its body. Living things, and I wasn't sure if they were feeding off of the things growing on this creature or putting it there. Maybe both. When it moved, it made sounds that were both dry and cracking, yet wet and mushy. Its back was to me, and it looked as though it was preparing something. A meal, maybe? The light was coming from under a very large pot with liquid in it. I suddenly became aware of the smell coming from that liquid, and it turned my stomach. At the time, I didn't know what that smell was. No 4 years old would or should. No 4 years old should ever know what human meat cooking should smell like. That creature heard me scurrying around in my cage and turned to look up. I wish it hadn't. The sight of its grotesque body and the sound of its hideous moist voice were enough for me, but it turned nonetheless. It turned, and I saw the face of evil. The face of evil knew I saw it and sneered, showing its pointy, uneven teeth and a mouth that was much too large. My God, that thing had teeth that looked like the rear end of a porcupine. They were long, skinny, and pointy. I knew right away if this thing bit me, those teeth would go all the way through my arm like a sharp knife slicing some butter that's been left out in the sun all afternoon at the family picnic. Its eyes were nothing more than little slits with glowing yellow coming from the centers. I didn't see a nose, but its ears were tall and ended in a point that leaned back away from the face. It also appeared to have something growing out of its back. If I were older, it may have taken me longer to figure it out, but being just a little girl who often fantasized about fairy tale creatures, I knew almost instantly what they were. I mean, they weren't like any I'd ever imagined, but they were wings nonetheless. They looked like more of that dry wood jutting out from the back in multiple branches. The branches were strung together with something that looked like skin. It was stretched and thin with holes in it here and there as if it had been torn by something, and the light shone through them, illuminating them in a way that made me quiver. Suddenly the world was going out of focus again, and I fell to the bottom of the cage, cutting my cheek on a twig as I did. I'm not sure how long I was passed out for either time. I do know that some time did pass, and when I awoke I was being lowered downward, my cage kind of bouncing and swinging as I got lower and lower. Panic hit me, and it hit me hard. That thing down there was lowering me. It was going to eat me up with those sharp, skinny, pointy teeth it had. I began to cry and slid myself back against the far corner of the cage. I had not been to the restroom since earlier that day, and while at age 4 it had been a good long time since I had any type of accident, I can assure you that when I came to face with this monster from the dark, my bladder let loose, and urine spilled out of my body and down my legs. It ran in a river to the edge of the cage and off onto the floor. I thought the creature was going to be mad, but it smiled happily instead. It was loving the fact that it scared the piss right out of my little body. It knew I was frightened, and it loved every minute of it. Once lowered, I came face to face with a creature most people never even see in their nightmares. It was like a combination of every horrifying creature created for the big screen all thrown into one beast. It sneered, and then from between its long, skinny teeth what appeared to be a serpent-like tongue jutted out and licked its lips. This time I was so scared I couldn't make a sound. My eyes squeezed shut tightly, and I prayed I was just dreaming. Inside my mind I screamed for this to please be a dream. When the creature spoke again, I knew it wasn't a dream, though, and I opened my eyes to face this monster. It said, "Time to eat, child, you're far too skinny." I slid back from the cage door as the creature removed the lock and pried it open. It had a bowl of something in its creepy long fingers, and it slipped it onto the floor of the cage and then closed the door once more. "Are you going to hurt me?" I asked, hopeful that the answer was no, but knowing that even if this thing said no, it would mean yes. Opening its gaping mouth once again into a grin evil enough to drive a sane man mad, it said, "Eat." and then I was being raised back up into the ceiling of this dark hole where the creature resided. Whatever was in that bowl smelled horrid, and as hungry as I wasn't going to touch it. I laid down in my cage and cried myself to sleep. I wanted my mommy. I wanted my bed. I wanted my stuffed bunny Marshmallow, whose fur was tarnished and dirty from the love of a 4-year-old girl who took it everywhere. I wanted to be anywhere but here. Here I would stay for another 2 weeks, though. Chapter 3. The days pass slowly when you're being held hostage by a creature in the dark. One day slowly rolled into 2, and by the 3rd day I was so hungry so that I ate the food that the beast gave me. He informed me that his name was Trekken, as in, Trekken says eat now. He took me out of the cage to clean it after a couple of days of me using part of it as a bathroom. Even then I knew it was disgusting, but I didn't have a choice. I tried to hold it. I begged him to let me out so I could go. He responded to my cries with screams and guttural noises that I wasn't sure if it was a language or just noise. I never told anyone about having to go to the bathroom in that cage, but if I'm going to give you the full account of my time there, then I'm going to go ahead and lay it all on the line. The 3rd day was also the day that Daisy showed up. I really liked her. I saw Trekken carry her in slumped over his shoulder and imagined I must have looked much the same when he brought me in. He popped her into a cage and raised it up near mine. She lay sleeping for what seemed like hours, and then slowly began to stir. It was very dark in there, but after time your eyes adjust and you can see well enough to make do. I saw when he brought her in that her hair was dark, either brown or black. She had a plump little body that had been poured into some pink overalls with a white shirt, already dirty from her trip here, under it. Her hair in 2 braids that hung to about the middle of her back. She was wearing a little pink shoe on one foot, but must have lost the other in transit because her other foot was bare. When she started to stir, I tried to quickly calm her. It didn't work. As soon as she opened her eyes to the darkness and then finally figured out what was happening, she had much the same reaction as myself. There were screams and cries and even some begging and pleading to be let go. Trekken paid no attention to any of these except to tell her to shut up. Once Daisy calmed down and began to accept her new reality, I spoke to her again in a whisper. "Hello, are you okay now?" I asked. I knew that neither one of us was okay, but I wasn't sure how else to begin our first conversation in this dark and dank environment. Daisy replied in a weepy voice, tired from screaming and crying, that she was for now. We talked for much of the night about our homes, our families, even our toys. I learned that she was 6 and in the 1st grade at her school called Hillside Elementary. She had a teacher named Miss Buckner who was nice most of the time, but sometimes got mad at this one kid named Sean and would yell loudly at him, which scared her. Daisy was shy and sweet and in some ways even more terrified than me. She was older, so maybe she had everything figured out before I did. Either way, I liked her and I felt so much better having someone to talk to. There were times over the next couple of days where I almost forgot where I was. There were times we even giggled as little girls do. Happy times were often cut short as we were lowered to face that horrid thing that resided below us so that he could feed us or clean our cages. If he thought we were too happy, he would poke those long fingers of his into our arms or legs until he punctured our delicate skin, bringing blood to the wounds and tears to our eyes. He loved to torment us. He loved to remind us that this wasn't summer camp. 6 days into my stay with Trekken, I asked him shyly what he was. He looked pleased. "Have you never seen a pixie before, child?" That sly smile touching his crooked mouth. I shook my head no and dropped my gaze to the floor of my cage. Looking into the murky eyes of that creature was something I cared not do for long. I am a wood fairy. My kind has ruled these forests for over 1,000 years and will continue to do so for many, many more. I had no doubt he was telling the truth. "What do you want with us?" I asked. "Dear sweet girl, there is only one use for a child of man." He paused dramatically and smiled in a manner even more gruesome than usual. "Your food," he said as he threw his head back and began laughing like the lunatic he clearly was. I wasn't surprised by this news. I mean, part of me hoped not, but part of me knew. He was feeding us often, and somehow I knew it was to fatten us up. Somehow I knew that this creature had one plan all along. and I knew that his plan never involved us going home again. Tears rolled down my face silently as he raised me back up next to Daisy. All the while he was laughing to himself. It was that day that I decided that Daisy and I needed to escape as soon as possible. Of course, poor Daisy would never step foot out of this creature's den again, but I didn't know that. I also didn't know that this creature, while nothing like the Pixies I had imagined in appearance, did in fact have magical qualities that would make escape even harder than imagined. It was in fact Daisy's death that led to my escape. I've always felt terrible for the loss of her, but at the same time at least her torment ended. Mine still continues all these years later as I wait for the return of that hideous creature named Trekken. I don't know how I know that he's coming, but I know nonetheless. Chapter 4. After being raised back up, I whispered to Daisy that we were going to have to get out of there. She agreed and we started hatching a plan. It was simple and not very well thought out at all. We were just young girls, ages 4 and 6 if you recall. Our plan was simply to wait to have our cages cleaned again and then to make a run for it. One of us, whoever he cleaned first, would push past Trekken and grab the huge spoon he stirred his pot with and hit him in the head with it as hard as she could. Then that girl would open the other cage and we would both run as far and as fast as our legs would carry us. It was simple. It was foolish. As if it would be that easy. Our young ages blinded us to the reality. Of course, reality is a fleeting thing for small children locked in cages in the den of a wood pixie anyways. Irony was definitely laughing at us throughout this ordeal. On the 8th day in Trekken's possession, our chance to escape came. It was Daisy he let out first, and she did as we had planned up high in our perch above his elongated head. He unlocked her cage and she made a mad dash, pushing into her door and knocking him off balance as she sprawled out past him on the dirt floor of his abode. She quick jumped to her feet and grabbed the large spoon and swung it hard as she could, smashing Trekken right in his mouth full of pointy, sharp teeth. I saw him grimace in pain, and part of me relished it even in that small moment of time, which was most likely no more than a microsecond. I yelled for Daisy to hurry and let me out as I shook the bars ferociously. Trekken wasn't knocked unconscious as we had planned, though. While being knocked down had shocked him and being hit had hurt him, it wasn't long before he recovered and was on his feet headed straight for Daisy with his long fingers reaching out for her. I saw panic in her face and an apologetic look as she turned away from me and ran for the door. She was leaving me. She was going to run and leave me here to be eaten by this creature. I understood, though. In that small flash of time, I knew I would have done the same. Daisy reached the door of the den and swung it open, throwing herself through it as fast as her pudgy little legs would permit. That's when it happened. That's when I realized that leaving this place was going to be even more of a challenge than I had previously thought. Daisy's body hit the doorway and not just bounced back, but was thrown backwards with the force of a Mack truck hitting her. She flew through the air and hit the far wall of the dome-shaped room. What I'm going to tell you next is graphic, but I see no point in making this out to be anything other than the full account of what I saw and heard during my stay with Trekken the Wood Pixie. Daisy hit that wall with such force that I could literally hear the bones in her little body break into pieces inside of her. The back of her skull flattened against the wall, and as she bounced off and hit the floor face first, she left behind what could only be blood and brain matter with chunks of skull that actually stuck into the wall. I let out a scream and fell backwards in my own cage. My only friend in this hellish place was dead. I know this sounds awful, but I didn't know what upset me more. The loss of her, the realization that I was alone with Trekken, or the realization that my own death was next. Either way, I lay there in the bottom of my cage, crying uncontrollably. Trekken had walked over to where Daisy lay in a pile of broken flesh and bone and was hovering above her. I heard him laugh maniacally, and then even through my own sobbing, I heard him say something that caught my attention. "Silly child of man," he said, "you can't leave this enchanted space without the key." I opened my eyes and looked at him and saw that he was holding out a rope from his neck. He was holding it out over her body and laughing. On the end of the rope, I saw a small charm. It wasn't a key at all, though. It was, my God, it was a tiny little unicorn. I had seen that tiny creature before. The last time was the day I was brought here, and it was alive. This time it was more like a little glass figurine, but it was the same creature. I was sure of it. Trekken picked up what was left of my new friend and carried her into the next room. I sat there debating in my mind how I could get that necklace from around Trekken's neck and escape this awful hole that he called Enchanted. The events of the day had worn on me, though, and I fell asleep leaning against the bars of my cage. When I awoke again, I peered down into the faint light below me to see Trekken coming back into the only room I had known for days now. He had a tray in his hands, and on the tray was pieces of meat and blood. He tipped the tray up and they slid into the boiling pot below me, splashing some of the hot liquid inside onto the floor. It was then that true terror touched my soul yet again. It was then that I realized that was he cooking my friend Daisy. It was then that I realized that the food I had been eating since the third day of my capture was whatever child had sat in this cage before me. The world got all wobbly and I felt everything in my stomach lurch up into my throat. It spewed from my mouth violently, and then the world went dark as I fell face first into my own freshly spewed vomit. Not a pretty picture, I know. One I wish wasn't locked into my memory, but that's what happened. Sometime later, I opened my eyes to my cage being opened, and I jumped backwards so hard I hit my head on the bars of the cage and saw stars. Trekken was peering in at me with his teeth showing in a snarl and saying something about I'd better not try anything or I'd be joining my friend sooner than later. His long wood-like fingers grabbed a hold of my tiny wrist, and he dragged me out of my cage in one movement and threw me to the floor. He towered over me and then grabbed a large bowl and, to my shock, dumped cold water right on top of me. "Dirty, filthy creatures children of men are," he said, shaking his head. Still, you could see the enjoyment he got out of dumping that cold water on top of me while I was still dazed and confused from the events of the day. One side of his face lifted in an Elvis-like sneer, and he dumped a second pot into my cage, rinsing away my vomit, urine, and feces. He grabbed another pot and dumped in some new leaves and twigs, and then grabbed my drenched body and lifted it back into the cage. He peered at me through the open door for a moment. I thought he was going to say something, but then he shut the door and locked it once again. He didn't raise me up, though. He left me hanging just a few feet from the ground and started to fill a bowl from the large pot in the center of the room that he had generously fed me from all along. I instantly started shaking my head and crying. He reopened the cage door and slid the bowl in. "Your friend is sweet as pie," he said, laughing as he started pulling the rope that rose my cage into the air. Once raised, I looked at the bowl and I cried. I told Daisy I was so sorry. I knew then that I would go hungry either until I finally died, Trekken finally killed me, or until I escaped this place. I was hopeful for an escape. My little brain just couldn't think of how to do it, though. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't figure out how I would ever be able to get down, get the key, and escape without being killed. 4 more days passed, and with each day I grew weaker from lack of food. The weaker I got, the less hope I had. I was now on my 12th day here in this hell, and I was now hoping more for death than anything. I just lay in the bottom of the cage, not moving, not speaking. I didn't cry, I didn't do anything. Honestly, I think that was also a big part of being able to escape. Trekken grew concerned. Not because I was weak, but because I was getting thinner and thinner. "You're no good to me without some meat on your bones," he said. He was clearly angry. He lowered my cage and stared at me. He must have been thinking of ways to get me to eat or deciding if he should just kill me now before I could lose more weight. But he said nothing, just stared. He stared for what seemed an eternity, but I was lost to my own little world, slowly dying as I lay there in the bottom of my cage. Trekken didn't bother to lift me back up. When he went to the other room for the night, he left me down low. I'm not sure if he didn't feel I was strong enough to be a problem, or if he just plain forgot. As I entered into day 13, I sat up slowly and looked around the room I was in. Escape hadn't crossed my mind just yet. At first I was merely looking to see if there was any food near enough to me to reach and eat. Across the room on a small table I saw something that looked like bread. My stomach growled and I touched the lock on my cage door, as if it would just pop open because I wanted it to. It didn't. I reached my arm through the cage and tried to grab the edge of the pot in the center of the room. My fingertips were about 2 inches shy of reaching it, and so I stretched and leaned. It was then that I realized my entire arm was now out of the cage and half of my head. I realized that it might be possible to slip my entire head out of the bars of the cage. I pushed and pain hit me instantly as my ears bent up tight against my head, and one of them scraped against the rough metal of the bar and ripped open. Blood came pouring down my neck and onto my shoulder. It wasn't enough to stop me from pushing, though. The pain in my ear was nothing compared to the pain in my stomach, and I pushed with barely a sound as my head popped out of the bars of the cage. Of course, now here I was, with my head and an arm hanging out of my cage about 3 feet from the ground and not sure what to do next. I was sure the rest of my withered body would slide through as well, but what if Trekken caught me? Fear made my heart pound against my tiny ribcage almost hard enough to physically see it. I decided I'd rather die fighting than laying in that cage. I don't know why I decided it. I don't know where that strength was for the days before this moment, but I was suddenly filled with the desire to live. Pushing through the bars was easier than I imagined it would be. After 4 days of not eating, my tiny body was little more than some skin and bones. Had I been in the air, this would have been pointless, but this close to the ground, it was an easy task. Of course, going head first was difficult, as I had to lean downward and fall to the ground head first as well. As I left the cage, it swung back away from me ever so slightly, and when it swung back, it hit me right in the side of my head just as I was setting myself upright. The metal created a gash that instantly began to bleed about an inch long, and I grabbed my head and cried out before I could stop myself. I stood there like a deer in the headlights, quite sure that Trekken was going to come running and destroy me with one hit from those pointy wooden claws of his. Everything remained quiet and nothing stirred, though. I walked over and grabbed the bread-like stuff from the little table and began shoving it into my mouth. It was the most delicious thing I had ever eaten in my life. It wasn't bread. It was better than bread. It was moist and sweet, and after just a few bites, I was already feeling full. I kept eating, though, until my little belly protruded. When I was done, I looked around the room once again. Something in my brain said I should climb my butt back into that cage and live to fight another day. Something else in me was screaming, though. It was screaming to me to find a weapon, to look for Trekken, to take that necklace, finally to escape this place. I listened to the second voice. After all, that one was much louder. Chapter 5. I slowly and quietly crept into the next room. Trekken was not there. It was a small room with tables and cabinets on one side. This was the room where he prepared the meat for his stews. There was also a hole in the floor to one side of the table. I peered in, and the smell came up and hit me in the face like a baseball being pitched by a professional pitcher. I knew right away that this hole was where he threw the parts he couldn't use. I almost lost the new food I had in my belly, but managed to keep it down. I rose from my knees and started to quietly open drawers looking for a weapon of sorts. On the third drawer, I found a knife. It wasn't very large, but it was sharp and it fit in my tiny hand nicely. I grabbed it and walked very slowly, one step at a time, to the next dark room. Although it wasn't a room, it was a hallway. I was so glad the floors were made of dirt. No squeaky wood boards like in my house. Down the hallway there were 2 doors, both closed. It was clear that Trekken was behind one of them. I was terrified that he was just standing there in the darkness of one of the rooms waiting to pounce. Suddenly, I was sure he left me down on purpose. I was sure this was all part of his game. He knew I couldn't escape the house, so he was playing with me before killing me. Maybe fear makes little girls taste better. I almost turned around and ran for the cage. I didn't, though. I continued down the hall and turned the first knob slowly. The room behind that first door was dark and smelled of mold and mildew. I knew immediately it was some sort of bathroom. I could hear drips of water coming from some source within the room, most likely some sort of sink or shower. I suddenly wondered if Trekken really showered and also if he pooped. Silly thought, I know. I even giggled a bit when I thought of him sitting on a toilet in that dank-smelling room. I clasped my own mouth so I wouldn't laugh out loud and continued on to the next door. I stood outside of it contemplating what I was going to do when I opened it. I couldn't for the life of me think even a minute ahead of my own actions. Finally, I just reached out and touched the knob. It was made of metal like my cage, but smooth. My hand almost slipped right off of it, but finally caught hold, and I turned it slowly and pushed. This door seemed heavier than the last, and as I pushed it open, a faint light hit me. Trekken, it seemed, slept with the lights on. Another thought that almost brought a laughing fit to my lips. I scolded myself inside my own head. There was nothing funny about this situation. Had I lost my mind? Although I suppose in some ways I had lost parts of it, I told myself it was just because I was so scared. I opened the door just enough to slip into the room that Trekken used as his bedroom. It wasn't like a human bedroom. There was no bed, no pictures, no decorations. It was simply an empty room with a large branch from a tree of some sort reaching from one side to the other. It stuck into the walls on either side, and Trekken was hanging from it. He was upside down, and his grotesque toes were wrapped around the branch, holding him there like a bat. His arms folded across his chest. He was snoring, this horrible, guttural sound that made me cringe and took away any feelings of wanting to giggle immediately. I walked over to him hanging there by his feet. I walked slowly, but I walked. One foot in front of the other, I walked until I was close enough to see those little bugs and wiggly things living on or in his body. I wondered what would happen if I stabbed him with the tiny knife I held in my hand. I decided that it wouldn't do much to this creature made mostly of wood, and decided against it immediately. I instead leaned in close and searched his neck with my eyes. There it was, the necklace with the unicorn pendant. I reached in, and just as I was about to touch it, Trekken moved. I thought it was over. I thought after all this he had woken up and saw me reaching for it, and any second those teeth would be cutting into my arm, probably tearing it off of my body in the process. My eyes closed tight, waiting for the pain. Nothing happened, though. I reopened my eyes and realized that he was still sleeping. I let the breath I had been holding in escape my mouth very slowly and sucked in a fresh batch before proceeding. My tiny fingers wrapped around the necklace, and I reached out with the knife in my other hand and sliced the rope holding it together around Trekken's neck. I backed up slowly all the way to the door in disbelief. I had it. The key, as he had said. When my back hit the open door, I turned and left the room as silently as I had come in. Back down to the hallway, through the prep room, and back into the main living area where I had been kept. I walked slowly to the main door, realizing now that I had no idea how the key worked. What if I opened the door and went through, only to be thrown into the wall like Daisy? A memory of her skull flattening against the wall popped into my head, and I shuddered. I took a deep breath, held the pendant in my hand, and opened the large door to the outside world. Shock hit me almost instantly. The sun was shining out there, and it was glorious, but something wasn't right. Everything was much too large. Trees jutted up into the blue sky that looked to be 1,000 feet tall. The leaves that had blown up next to the door of my captor's residence were taller than me. A bird flew by overhead. Just a simple blue jay, but it was the size of a minivan at least. I gasped. Then I heard something behind me. Trekken was awake and coming down the hall. No time to wait. I reached out and stuck my hand holding the pendant out of the doorway. It went with ease and grew instantly. There I was, a tiny girl on one side of the door and a giant hand on the other. Footsteps were growing louder, and I flung the rest of my body out of the doorway, instantly growing back to my original size. I stumbled and fell to my knees. I looked back to see a very small door opened in the base of a large old oak tree. I quick shut it tight and held my hand against it while looking for a rock to put against it. Just as I spotted the perfect one, I heard a ghastly howl from behind that tiny door. Trekken had discovered my escape. He sounded furious. I grabbed a rock, stuck it against the door, and ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. I wasn't sure where I was or where I was going, but I ran. After what seemed an eternity of running, just as my tiny legs started to give out, I came across a small dirt road. I fell to the ground as I got to it and just laid there, sprawled out and gasping. I heard something coming closer, and I knew in my heart it was Trekken. He had pushed that rock aside, escaped his home, grown to enormous size, and tracked me down to the side of this little road. I was too scared to even move as the noise drew closer. I closed my eyes tight and hoped maybe he wouldn't see me. Maybe he would run right past me, but then I heard a voice. Oh my God, it's a little girl. It was a man's voice, not a monster's. Quick, Eileen, get a blanket and come quick, she's still breathing. A pause, and then, Sweetie, are you okay? What happened?" I couldn't talk, though. Tears were running down my face by the gallon as this stranger and his wife, Eileen, wrapped me in a blanket and put me in their car. Eileen hugged me to her as her husband rushed us to the nearest hospital. It was there that the questions began. There that the strange stares, whispered disbelief, and judgment started. It was also there that I finally got to hug my mother again. It was there that I got to bury my dirty, tear-soaked face into her wonderful lavender-smelling hair. My mother was always a proud woman, well put together, well groomed, and one of those never let them see you cry types. When I saw her again after my 2 weeks in the woods, she had changed, though. Her hair a mess, she had lost weight, her clothes disheveled, and her face covered in tears to match my own. "Where have you been, baby?" was all she could muster in those first moments. Days passed and my mother never left my side. I was cleaned up, my wounds dressed and rehydrated. The staff sent a psychologist to talk to me when my story of where I had been didn't change for the police. They were convinced that I had created this story of an evil pixie to cover up the weeks of abuse I must have suffered at the hands of whatever man had kidnapped me. They were grateful that I hadn't been violated physically, and couldn't understand how they had missed this man's residence in all the searches they had done of the woods. They were going to continue to search, though, and they assured my mother they would find the monster responsible. The doctors eventually had no choice but to send me home with my mother, and hope that someday my memory would return so they could know what the man looked like and maybe more about his home. They said it was perfectly normal for me to make up stories and not to worry, but I could tell my mother was worried. Not because she thought I was crazy. She was worried because she knew me and she was worried I was telling the truth. About a week after I returned home, a police officer named Dan Peters stopped by our little home in the woods. He asked my mother if he could speak to her in private. My mother asked me to go to my room and wait there for a moment. I didn't like being away from her, and had in fact slept in her bed every night since I had been home, but I did as I was asked. I left my door open and stood near it, though, ready to run back to her should anything happen. From my doorway I could hear them talking in hushed tones. I heard something about Daisy. I could hear my mother say what a shame it was and how badly she felt for the family. I could hear her saying that she would talk to me and let him know. Then I heard our creaky front door close and my mother's footsteps coming toward my room. She smiled as she entered into my field of vision, but her smile was no longer the same as it had been. My absence had not only changed me, it had changed her. "I need to ask you something, baby girl." An undertone of seriousness, maybe sadness. "The little girl Daisy you said you met while you were away. You said she was killed, right?" I could tell this topic wasn't something she wanted to discuss, but the officer had asked her to question me and she had little choice because she wanted to find this man who had stolen her daughter from her. I nodded. She asked me if I could describe her. Of course I could. Daisy had been my best friend, my only friend in that disgusting little hole, and I remembered her vividly. The doctors and police had thought I made her up too, like a sort of imaginary friend, as it were. It wasn't until weeks later that they realized a little girl named Daisy had been reported missing in the next town over and put 2 and 2 together. Daisy's family wanted desperately to find her, of course, and their only hope was a little girl who claimed Pixies had done it, and their little girl was dead. My mother questioned me off and on for days. She explained how important the truth was. She told me how much it would help if I could just remember even one thing about the man who had taken me. That even if Daisy was in fact dead, finding her body would be tremendously helpful for her family, and would provide closure for them. I told her over and over that I was telling the truth. Finally, my mother called the police officer and told him that I still had no memory of the man or the home. I heard her apologize and tell him she would call if anything changed. It never did. Years passed and Mother and I moved to Georgia to be closer to her sister Annie. She said she could use my mother's help with her 4 children, but I knew it was more like my mother could use her help. Our bills were behind, and since Mrs. Willow had passed, work for my mother had been scarce. We were still the talk of the town, and I was always known as the strange little girl who had lost touch with reality. I was teased by children and pitied by adults. A change was just what we needed, according to my mother. So we moved. We decided there would be no more talk of the past. Everything was fresh and new from that moment on. I had agreed and never spoke another word to her about my time with Trekken. He was never far from my thoughts, though. Even though I was now 9 years old, I still feared that creature coming for me. I stayed close to people and even after the move slept in the same room as my mother until I was nearly 13 years old. I was terrified to be alone. I was right to be. At age 13, I saw Trekken again. I saw him briefly, but I saw him. I was outside in the yard with my little cousin Abby. She was running through the sprinkler and squealing with joy. Every time the cold water touched her, it bounced off of her and the sun hit it, making it glitter like silver. Back and forth she went, and I sat under the tree nearby and watched, giggling. I envied her youth, her innocence. It was something I had lost at age 4, and though I was still just a young girl of 13, my eyes told a different story. My eyes were those of an old lady who had seen much and lived long. Then something else caught my eye. There was something by the tree off to the side of the property. At first I thought it was just the tree, but then it moved. My heart skipped a beat and my breath caught in my throat. The smile left my face along with all the color. The thing next to the tree sneered. I saw an enlarged mouth filled with long, sharp, pointy teeth and yellow eyes glowing through small slits in the wooden face. It was him. I screamed and passed out. I could hear someone calling my name and I was sure it was Trekken. I started punching, hitting, thrashing about before I even opened my eyes, and I heard, "Ow, she hit me." I stopped and looked around to see my aunt standing there holding her bloody lip, and the rest of the family staring at me like I was a mad woman. I started to apologize immediately, but then fear caught me again and I pushed everyone out of my field of vision. I looked at the tree across the yard, but Trekken was gone. When everyone asked me what was wrong, I apologized again and said it must have been the heat was too much for me. My mother helped me into the house and got me some ice water, asking if I needed a doctor. I told her no, that I'd be fine, but I'll tell you, I was shaken to my core. Trekken had escaped. Not only that, he had found me. I saw him again a week later and a month after that. He never came close, but he always popped up when I least expected it and sneered at me in that sly little smile that said I would pay for escaping. I started to research Pixies. Turns out there were others who had been abducted and escaped their grasp as well. Not many, none currently living. There were a few accounts of their stories in books, though. Most of them were pretty similar to mine. One little boy named Jonathan had escaped, and then, much like myself, began seeing his captor later on down the line when he was older. He said for years she, yes, a girl pixie, although similar in appearance to Trekken, had just popped in almost as if to say hello. He said he had finally come to the conclusion that she could not capture him again. Something about the magic only worked on the mind of children who believed in magic. Once you had matured or lost your innocence, the hypnotic music could no longer be heard by your ears, and whatever pendant they had used as their key no longer came to life to lure you in. I had brought Trekken's key with me when I escaped, but the police had put it in evidence. Weeks later it had disappeared and was never seen again. I knew he had retrieved it. As I've gotten older, though, and my mind has grown dimmer, more like that of a child at times, I have sworn I could hear a faint music in the distance. During these episodes, I've been told I just get up and head off towards the woods as if in a daze. I often awake to one of the nurses here at Wildwood Nursing and Rehabilitation Center shaking me gently and calling my name. It terrifies me because I know that even though Trekken could not get revenge on me all these years ago, I have now come full circle back to the innocent mind of a child at times, and I know he is just biding his time and waiting for me. I have tried to tell the nurses to please watch me closely, to please not let me go into the woods. I have begged them to please keep me safe from the Pixies. They always smile at me and tell me to calm down and not to worry. I worry, though. I worry every moment that my thoughts are lucid. I look over to the woods and I see Trekken sometimes, standing there by the trees and smirking. He hasn't changed a bit even though I have aged decade after decade. I fear I shall be gone soon, but I wanted someone to know my story. I wanted someone to know that I did not wander off and disappear into the woods. I want someone to know that when I am gone, it is because I have heard that hypnotic music and once again seen that magical little unicorn with the jewel-encrusted horn. I want someone to know that I have reached out even though I was scared and touched that horn, and that I was then shrunk down and dragged into a doorway. A small doorway in the base of a giant tree. Once there, I want someone to know that Trekken will be waiting for me to awaken so that he can torment me before finally lunging at me and sinking those horrible teeth deep into my throat. The last thing I will see is the ceiling of that little dark dome as the blood leaks from my body and I die the death I should have died many moons ago. I know in my heart of hearts that Trekken will look at me laying there on his dirt floor, and he will smile that horrendous, crooked, jagged smile and enjoy a sweet revenge. No one ever truly escapes a pixie. I know that now. No one ever really escapes true evil. Wait, what's that I hear? Do you hear it? It's music. Sweet melodic music, like an angel playing a small flute. It's beautiful. I wonder what it is. I'll continue this when I return from seeing where it's coming from. It sounds like it may be coming from that tree. Over there. Hey family. A very big thank you to Dawn Marks for allowing me to narrate such an awesome tale. Be sure to check out their Creepypasta.com profile for more of their awesome works. If you would like to support us and make a donation, I'd be very much appreciative. I do have PayPal and a Buy Me a Coffee account. Be sure to also check out our merch store. There are plenty of items and designs to choose from. If you enjoyed this video, then why not check out the next one? Here, on the right-hand side. You can also follow us. All my socials and all my other links are contained within the Linktree link below. Take care, everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful and peaceful night. And don't forget, where fear is, happiness is not.